Chapter 57, A Cowled Dance. There was a tense excitement building that morning, everyone moving between each other's rooms in an informal flurry of last preparations as the group readied themselves for their descent into the crypts. Frith's door was still open. Minsk had not long left after she had helped him with his van braces. The girl currently bent double as she struggled into her chain mail, listening to the sounds of the others gathering in the hall outside.
Minsk, do you have the spare lantern? Oh, I think I've forgotten my, oh no, there it is. My raven. Just a moment.
Fritha rolled her shoulders one last time, her head finally emerging as the shirt slipped on.
There, now what?
She stopped as she noticed Herr Dallas stood in her open doorway, his hand resting casually on the shoulder of the skinny young boy before him.
Oh, Mech, no.
She sighed.
Not now, I was only just there yesterday.
The boy shook his head, looking remarkably sympathetic.
I ain't care about the theater, m'lady. I've come with a message. Some blokes just pitched up at the play who's asking for you.
Mech sent her a dark look, says
he's from the Cowled Wizards.
They were marching briskly along the wide stone corridor, their footsteps echoing on the marble floor as they followed the loping gait of the gangly young man. Fritha spared a glance to the woman next to her, Jahara sending her a wary frown in reply. They had left the others in the coronet not long ago with plans to start their search of the crypts without them, they themselves returning quickly to the theater with Mech to meet their cowled wizard. Fritha was not sure what she had been expecting, but it had not been the rather pimply youth who had greeted their arrival, the boy no older than 16 winters with the pale weedy look of one who did not see enough sunlight. He was an amiable lad though, instantly introducing himself as Mateen, the apprentice to a mage of some power and influence who requested their presence, though he could give no details as to why. Fritha let her attention shift back to the cool stone hallway. They had never been upstairs in the council buildings before, for access was restricted for common citizens, and it surprised her at how much quieter it was than the ground floor, with its chaos of clerks and city guards dashing back and forth. Here, the corridors were empty save for the occasional person in robes who drifted silently past them. Fritha looked again to Jahara, her hushed voice coming out as a hiss.
What do you think this summons could mean then? Perhaps they've realized Imoen's innocent. Perhaps they're going to release her.
Jahara sent her a stern, almost pained look.
Now, it is not wise to get your hopes up, Fritha. No, I know,
she conceded, trying and failing to quell said feeling in her heart,
but what else could it be? Here, ladies,
came the youth ahead of them, the apprentice opening the door they had come to and bowing them inside. It was not a large room and seemed even smaller due to the huge desk that had been placed in its center, 2 chairs before it, while behind sat a tall rake-thin man of middling years, his brown hair slicked back to best show off his strong forehead, his neat beard not quite hiding the lack of chin. He was just as pasty as his apprentice but colder with it, thin wire-framed glasses perched upon his long nose as he read from the parchment before him as though oblivious to their entrance. Bookshelves lined the walls around them with the exception of the one behind him, in which was set instead with a large window that looked out over the formal gardens, the light from which falling, either by design or coincidence, over the man, giving him a glowing aura of light that could not help but look impressive.
Sir,
ventured the youth. The man glanced up, absently adjusting his spectacles to finally recognize them.
Ah, yes, do have a seat, ladies. That will be all, Mateen.
The youth shut the door without a word. Fritha sat as she was bade, but just barely, and the girl could feel herself twitching, just desperate for news of her friend.
Now then,
the mage smiled, coolly dropping his attention to them.
My name is Toljarias. I have heard much of your reputation about the city, especially your apprehension of the bridge murderer, and I have been wondering if you would like to hunt a similar fellow who has been evading capture by the cowled wizards for almost a 10-day now. You know of the prevailing attitude towards magic here in I assume.
Frithia considered that it was an attitude hardly helped by the actions of those supposedly administrating it, though she merely nodded once for him to continue.
Indeed. Well, for some it is even more than that, manifesting in a palpable hatred. One particular man has murdered 2 of our number in cold blood. He is currently in hiding and I wish for you to find him.
Frithia nodded again, waving all this away with a hand.
As you say, but first things first, where's Imoen? Firstly, I want to know she's well, then.
Tolgerias looked genuinely confused.
I beg your pardon, but Imoen? I am sure I have no idea about whom you are speaking, miss. What? Are you joking? You summoned me here and don't even know about her.
Frithia did not recall standing up, but she was certainly on her feet now, leaning over his desk as she continued her tirade.
Imoen is the girl who was arrested in the promenade over 2 months ago for doing nothing more than trying to protect herself against the man who for the last 10 days had been her torturer.
For all his previous coolness, Tolgerias looked a touch ruffled now.
Oh, yes, I do recall something, though I fear I have nothing to do with magical enforcement,
he soothed mechanically, before steering them neatly back to his own concerns.
But, I suppose I could make some inquiries, perhaps even put forward for a pardon, that is, of course, if you agree to help me.
Frithia glanced back to Jahara, the woman nodding imperceptibly, and the girl felt something inside her break as all her hopes were sudden crushed. She slumped back into chair with a sigh to ask dully,
"What's his name then?" Lord Valigar Corthala. Anything?
Came Frithia eagerly, and Jahara shook her head, throwing the small card onto the growing pile of documents before them.
No, just another invitation to some ball or other. It seems the Corthala family is quite well respected, at least, it was once.
After their very brief meeting with Tolgerias had concluded, Madine had shown them straight to a small estate in the northwest of the city where they had commenced to search the Corthala home room by room, finally finding themselves in the small wood-paneled study on the 2nd floor. Jahara looked about the room from where she was knelt with Frithia on the floor before a large bookcase, the pair searching through the books and documents that were stacked neatly upon it. Something, in fact, that had been disturbing Jahara ever since they had arrived at the house. She watched as the clouds shifted outside and shaft of sunlight poured through the small window next to them, the usual constellation of dust it should have revealed, reduced to a mere few specks of gold, swirling in the light. The study was too tidy, too clean. There were barely enough books to fill half the bookcase, and Jahara suspected that they were not the first ones to have searched the place, the cowled wizards likely taking anything they deemed of value as soon as Valigar had abandoned his home. But why? What could have so interested them? Tolgerias was not telling them something, of that Jahara was sure. But what? Frithia tossed the parchment she had been reading onto the pile as well and sat back on her haunches with a sigh.
This is useless, we've been here all day and we still know nothing more than what Tolgerias told us. That Valigar Corthala, the last son of a local noble house, suddenly decided to up and start a one-man campaign against the cowled wizards and murdered 2 of their number. If they were anything like Tolgerias, I have every sympathy for him. Indeed. And now he's given them the laugh and we're supposed to find him. And bring him in alive,
added Jahara, sending the girl next to her an stern look. Frithia dropped her attention back to the papers before them, looking uncomfortable.
Tolgerius said he needed to face justice. We can kill him if he forces us to. Yes, though in that instance we have to bring back his whole body as proof of it,
pressed Jahara.
Why not just the head, that is usually sufficient after all? There's something very odd about this whole thing and I do not trust Tolgerius.
Fritha shook her head, smiling wryly.
No, well, I agree with you there, but if this Valigar has murdered 2 people then he needs to face justice, one way or another, and if a certain way will lead us to Imoen then that is the path I intend to take.
The girl glanced to her with an unusually open look.
I can't let any doubts ruin this chance, Jahara, she has been gone too long now as it is.
Jahara nodded and the pair of them turned back to the pile before them, the druid rising stiffly after a moment to start searching through the desk, her fingers moving over the differing textures of the papers within the drawers. Bill, letter, bill. Her fingers brushed against something cool and hard in the back of the drawer and Jahara withdrew an old iron key.
You found something?
Came Fritha at her shoulder.
I do not know, perhaps. A key,
the girl confirmed.
And quite a thick one, for a strongbox or a door perhaps. Or it could just be an old key to something not even this Valigar remembers.
Jahara brought it closer to her face, trying to decipher the letters that were raised along one side.
Something in Wellings? Does that mean anything to you?
Fritha shook her head, casting her eyes about the rest of the room.
Are we done, do you think?
Jahara sighed and nodded, handing her the key as she tidied the documents back into the desk and shut the drawer.
Yes, this place has been picked clean.
Jahara drew a deep breath of cold afternoon air, glad to be out of that house as the pair of them set off, heading back towards the river and the south of the city.
So what do you think our next step should be?
Asked Fritha and Jahara sighed.
Well, it is unlikely we will get any more information than we have already from the cowled wizards and the fugitive's house had yielded no clues, so I suppose next we should visit the scene of the murder and after that we will have to merely rely on our own sources of investigation.
Jahara glanced to her, smiling slightly.
Perhaps you can ask your Renal if he knows anything.
Fritha laughed.
Oh, he's my Renal now, is he? Well, I'll certainly ask him. I can go after our meeting with the magistrate tomorrow. Does Cern know we have arranged to meet with Magistrate Ionulan?
Jahara shrugged. They had taken the time to collar the magistrate's secretary before leaving the council buildings that morning, using the considerable reputation Fritha and their group had about the city to manage to get an appointment to meet with the woman on the morrow, for all the good it would do.
I told Cern I would try to arrange something and I have.
Jahara sighed, recalling her conversation with the druid before they had left the coronet. It was the first of the 3 days of full moon tonight and Cern had looked more than wan that morning, though with all that had transpired it was hard to tell whether the moon alone had been source of his restlessness. Fritha frowned slightly, looking unconvinced.
Do you even think Bylina will be able to do anything? Honestly? No, I do not, and a part of me even wonders if she should. It is as you said, the child does not even know Cern. To take the boy away from all that he has known without any reason would be cruel and quite unnecessary. Yes, that is so.
The girl agreed absently, seemingly lost in her own thoughts for a moment before she turned back to her once more.
Still I suppose we should look into it, just on the outside chance. After all, Cern should at least get to meet his son, and Phoenicia did say this Diril fellow was an odd one. Gallia's death sounded a touch suspicious to me. Yes, well, that is one thing that would perhaps bear investigation, though in being a bad husband it does not necessarily follow that you are a bad person, as Cern himself proves.
The druid smiled faintly, and for a moment she was a whole world away as she added,
"It makes me realize sometimes, how blessed I was to have Khalid."
Frithha smiled as well, though she said nothing. They had reached one of the smaller wooden footbridges that spanned the river by now, the pair halting before it and ignoring the people bustling past them, some pushing handcarts probably taking deliveries to the northern estates, while others looked to be servants out on errands for the noble households they served, their manners brisk and purposeful behind the neat uniforms. The sun was already on its descent, the people on the bridge little more than hunched silhouettes against the dark yellow sky, and Jahara fancied they all held the same weary look that she had seen before in such places, as though the city life had a way of eroding people's spirits.
"Are you coming back to the inn for dinner?"
Jahara asked, though she suspected she already knew the girl's answer, Frithha shaking her head.
"No, I'll get something at the Five Flagons. Higold collared me when we arrived to meet Mateen, he wants my opinion on some scene or other." "They work you too hard at that theatre."
Frithha sent her a tired grin. "Yes, well, as Higold would say,
art is suffering. Give my regards to the others if you see them."
Jahara smiled slightly, watching her disappear along the street before she turned to take her first step onto the bridge. Ari moved slowly along the tunnel, her eyes searching every shadow, ears pricked for any unfamiliar sounds over their echoing footsteps and the creak of armor. She sighed tiredly and instantly wished she hadn't, the air dry and stale, heavy with the scent of embalming fluid and general decay. They had been down in the crypts since mid-morning, walking the labyrinth of tunnels, the open alcoves that lined the walls and the desiccated corpses they held so disturbing at first, now barely worthy of note, even the most frightening of places dull after so long. Minsk was leading the way, his bald head gleaming slightly in the light of the lantern carried by the silver-haired Lathandite priest next to him. Father Lytham, as he had introduced himself, was the head of exequies at the temple and an expert on the sprawling mass of crypts that spanned under the southwest of the city, from the temple district all the way to the cemetery. He had joined them at Dawn Master Creel's insistence, the man unwilling to lose any more people to the twisting maze of catacombs, and the old priest had proved an invaluable guide, leading them unerringly as they searched the southern quarter of the crypts where the child and then the priests had first disappeared. Ari watched as the pair halted a moment, Minsk kindly taking the lantern while Lytham consulted his map before they continued their path, and the group set off once more. Behind them, Cerned was walking alone, his weathered face looking even older in the marshy glow of his wear-light and holding a melancholy she had not seen in him before. She had tried to speak to him earlier, and though polite as he had been, it had been clear he had not wanted company, and she had dropped back to walk with Inomen and Herdalis at their rear soon afterwards. Ari sighed slightly to herself. She could not help but feel for the druid. That he knowingly left his child seemed impossible to the elf, the man more a victim of cruel circumstance in her mind, than an uncaring philanderer, though she did realize that many things had come to light yesterday that he had not told her of, even with the apparent openness she thought she had enjoyed with him. Ari found Herdalis's hand in the gloom and squeezed it slightly, suddenly very glad to have him as her own, for all their differences and his reluctance to deal with anything outside the present, be it past or future, she never once had any fear he would desert her. He sent her smile in the darkness, his voice hushed.
"Is something wrong, my dove?" "No, nothing. I was just thinking about poor Cerned."
"Oh yes," the bard agreed quietly and with much more enthusiasm that Ari thought was appropriate,
"it is quite the bother he has found himself in, hasn't he? Have you no sympathy for him?"
she reproached, though the tiefling merely shrugged.
"No, why should I? He brought all his troubles upon himself, after all. He did not know he had a child." "No, but he knew well enough he had a wife and he should not have married her to start with had he any doubts.
Ari blinked, both surprised and impressed by his vehemence.
And I suppose you have never broken such a vow?
Came an omen from behind them, his tone almost conversational.
Most assuredly not, my hound.
Herr Dallas exclaimed, looking as offended as Ari had ever seen him, though he did relent to dropping his voice once more when Minsk glanced back to them with a frown, the bard continuing in a hiss,
I never make promises I cannot keep.
An omen raised an eyebrow, coolly appraising the man.
But does that show a devotion to keep your word or merely never to give it?
Herr Dallas shrugged.
In some instances, yes, I would refuse to make any vow, but I find that preferable to breaking one's word. Nevertheless, do not mistake me, knight, I never deal in falsehoods when it comes to matters of the heart. Only misery comes from such deceits, however one may think they are sparing another's feelings.
An omen nodded once.
An honorable sentiment.
Indeed, the tiefling continued, and Ari could not fail to notice the mischievous glint to his dark eyes.
And I wonder then, when you intend to apply such honesty to your own relations, it is unkind to keep the lady in suspense, an omen.
Ari heard herself gasp.
You have a lady, an omen? Of course not.
He snapped, the gloom not quite hiding the sudden flush to his face as Herr Dallas continued, nudging him slyly.
Not yet anyway, I imagine there will be quite a few accomplished young ladies flocking about now you've been knighted. If that is the only reason the lady favors me, I fear I may find it difficult to return her regard,
said an omen matter-of-factly,
be she accomplished or not.
Herr Dallas gasped dramatically, pretending to swoon.
Such nobility of heart, I cannot compete. Go, sweet Ari, go and marry him before another lucky maid secures his hand. Herr Dallas, don't be silly, I wouldn't marry a knight,
she giggled, suddenly whirling to an omen, worried she had offended him.
Well, what I mean is, if I were to get married, I would want to be with my husband all the time. I should not want him to go away on dangerous campaigns for months on end, I would worry and miss him. But I understand not everyone like that.
An omen frowned, looking as uncomfortable as he did interested.
And you imagine my wife would be a woman such as that?
Ari nodded sincerely.
Well, yes. I suppose I always imagined your wife would be a noble woman who would be happy in her duties of the home, waiting for your return. Indeed,
agreed Herr Dallas with a broad smile,
Fritha and I were talking on this just the other night. You were?
Choked an omen.
Oh, yes, and the raven quite agrees with your choice, a nice dutiful noblewoman to bear your children and bake your bread. Why, no home should be without one. And what makes you all think I should want such obligated relations?
An omen demanded hotly, and Ari glanced to Herr Dallas, genuinely puzzled by the knight's displeasure.
Well, I suppose that was rather short-sighted of us, she conceded. I mean, there are a few ladies within the order like Irlina, who would want nothing more than to travel and fight as you do. Sorry, have I offended you, an omen?
She continued quickly as the man's face took on a stony look.
I didn't mean to. No, my lady, I should be grateful that the three of you have given the matter such careful thought. An omen. Ugh, why are we even speaking of this nonsense?
An omen cut himself off with a shake of his head, drawing a deep breath and slowly releasing it before continuing, his voice calmer, albeit in a strained sort of way.
I am sorry, Ari, but we should remain alert, there are many dangers down here for the unwary.
And with that, he quickened his pace slightly to move ahead of them and walk alone. Ari glanced to Herr Dallas, the man shrugging once at her questioning look, seemingly no wiser than she as to what could have annoyed the knight so.
"Hold everyone,"
came the ranger's voice, echoing slightly in the tunnel ahead of them.
"Who has found something?"
The pair had come to a halt just before a fork in the tunnel, one side continuing on into the darkness while the other opened out into a small chamber, their lights falling on a large stone sarcophagus, its lid half removed, an assortment of pots and chests set about it, both they and the tomb looking as though they had been recently looted. But it was not this that had brought the two men to a stop, and Ari moved forward with the others to see a pile of corpses just dumped in the middle of the tunnel. They were little more than bones and burial shrouds now after being down there so long, the bodies clearly taken from the nearby crypts to allow whoever have done so to search the alcoves for whatever small treasures they had been buried with.
"Tomb robbers,"
confirmed Lytham with a sigh.
"We do not usually get them down here, not when there are richer picking in the cemetery above, but—"
He trailed off, crouching down to heave the first body back into its alcove, Minsk and Anoman moving quickly to help him as Ari hurried forward to gather up the mess of random bones that littered the dusty ground.
"Ah, and here is our culprit, my birds,"
came Herr Dallas cheerily from just inside the chamber. Cernde moved to join him, lowering his staff and the wear-light that clung to it, and crouching to examine the body of a man, graying skin hanging slack on his pale face.
"From the state of decay he cannot have been down here more than a 10-day at most."
Cernde directed the light lower to reveal a neat slash across his stomach, the dried blood staining his tunic black.
"But what could have killed him?"
Herr Dallas shrugged.
"Perhaps those he came with turned stag and left his body down here with the rest of the corpses. Look,"
he continued, moving over to another crumpled heap towards the back of the chamber,
"there is an, ah!"
Herr Dallas shrieked as a fleshy grey hand shot from the pile to grab his wrist. The tiefling freed himself with a sweep of his blade, springing back and shaking off the severed hand that still clung to his arm, and Ari could not help a scream as a ghostly figure swept up from the sarcophagus to shriek,
"Defilers! Thieves! Leave this place!"
Suddenly, the crumpled forms of the two bodies they had found and third still hidden in the darkness at the back of the chamber rose haltingly to begin shambling towards them with stilted movements. Their group seemed to back away as one, Lytham and Anoman instantly fumbling at their necks, and Ari followed suit, her hand closing about the cord there and drawing up a small gold pendant in the shape of a raccoon's face, the symbol of her god. The others were already holding their own holy symbols out before them, chanting prayers under their breath, and Ari joined them, the prayer song of the wild places coming instantly to her lips as she warded the creatures. The bodies of the three tomb robbers, pale and slack-limbed, suddenly began to shudder and finally stopped their slow advance, halting for a moment and swaying as they groped listlessly at some invisible barrier before one by one they crumpled to the floor, dead again, and truly so this time.
"What is the meaning of this, spirit?"
demanded Anoman angrily, though the spectre seemed not to have heard him, the creature not sparing him a glance as it continued to moan pitifully.
"No, no, arise my servants! Destroy them! We have not come to rob you,"
ventured Ari, taking a step towards it, the spirit seeming to calm slightly at her approach, milky eyes regarding her passively.
"Please, we are looking for some others, people from the temple like us and a small boy. Please, have you seen them?"
The spirit just shook its head though, twisting in the air.
"No, no, leave, you must leave here. Servants, arise, come to my aid." "It is no good,"
sighed Lytham, sending her a kind smile.
"This spirit is but a manifestation of a lingering resentment, likely fed by more than one of the poor defiled dead down here. The true consciousness of this body you see in the sarcophagus is long departed, we will get nothing useful from this spectre."
He raised his hand, the golden sunburst of his holy pendant glinting in the collective glow of their wear lights.
Spirit, by the eternal light of Lathander, I lay thee to rest.
The wraith seemed stirred by a wind that only it could feel, and Ari watched as it flicked and finally faded with a long rasping sigh. Lytham shook his head, returning the holy symbol to beneath his robes and moving forward to heave close the lid of the sarcophagus.
I shall have to send some people down for these poor unfortunates once it is safe to do so,
he continued half to himself, gesturing to the three bodies before turning back to them.
Well, shall we continue on then?
A nod traveled them, the group falling back into formation, and they set off once more into the darkness. Anoman set his cup back onto the table before him, letting his eyes drift without really seeing over the fine furniture and colorful tapestries of a tavern, a far cry from the one he currently called home. He had agreed to join Simon and Eric for a drink that evening, the three meeting in the Myth Rest Inn at sundown, all making the most of the fact that, for the time being at least, they were all in the city together.
So, I hear you are aiding us Lathandites at the moment?
Anoman glanced distractedly back to the table, to see Simon looking at him expectantly.
Oh, yes, a child from the temple school went missing a few days ago now, in the crypts beneath the city, something to do with a game of dares the children were playing.
He explained for Eric's benefit, trying to at least temper the disapproval in his tone. Though they were only young, he could not have imagined anyone at his own seminary ever dreaming of doing anything so foolhardy, though he had to admit, it sounded just like the sort of thing Simon would have been more than happy to join in with when he was younger, the squire nodding earnestly, oblivious to his thoughts.
Yes, I spoke to the priest about that. I was even released from my duties at the order to offer my own services in the search, though Don Master Creel said they had things in hand at the time. He no doubt thought they did. He sent 2 of the temple guards and a cleric looking for the boy. That they should go missing as well, I could barely have believed it. We searched the whole southern quarter of the crypts today and there is still no sign of them.
Simon shook his head, looking for a moment serious, before the smile was back once more.
Well, I am glad, at least, that you and your companions are looking into it. Does Fritha have any idea what could have happened to them? I would, of course, ask her myself, but I again notice the distinct absence of your red-haired friend. I thought you were going to ask her to join us, Anoman.
Anoman flushed, Eric hiding his smile in his cup.
She had things to attend to tonight at the theater.
Simon frowned.
Anoman, you did invite her, didn't you? As I said, Simon, she already had plans. But,
a look from Eric stopped the squire and Simon leaned back in his chair with a defeated sigh.
Fine, fine.
A silence descended upon the table, each man returning his attention to his drink, the moments creeping slowly by until...
But I think you're making a grave mistake,
came Simon firmly, the man ignoring their protests to barrel on regardless.
Fritha is never going to see you as anything more than a companion in arms unless you give her some sign.
Anoman shifted uncomfortably in seat, his face burning.
Simon, I appreciate your concern, but this matter is not one I care to discuss. Now, can we please just have a quiet drink as we planned? Yes, all right,
conceded Simon with a sigh, still looking a touch mutinous.
Only let's move on, eh? The company in here is fast going downhill.
Anoman turned to follow his friend's gaze, watching as Caudrel stepped through the tavern doors behind them, and the night needed no further excuse. The three left the Myth Rest and moved along to the Goose and Grain, where the lively music made for pleasant atmosphere even if the thoughts it recalled to him were less so. Anoman unable to watch the couples dancing without seeing Fritha and the tiefling, knowing that somewhere else in the city they had been so engaged. All their foolish talk of marriage had annoyed him today, the way they all seemed to have agreed on who he would end up with without even consulting him, the fact they had even considered it. And Ari's words about how she would miss and worry for her husband had rather brought home to him something he had only seen from his own perspective before. Him going away on glorious campaigns with his brothers from the Order, battling injustice and tyranny. Now it was tinged with a sadness as he imagined the wife he had left behind, and he considered that when Frithha had teased him about marrying a baker, perhaps her fondness for bread was not the only appeal of such a husband. Anoman frowned, pulling his mind away from this and back to his own friends as they talked and drank the sweet spiced mead the tavern was famed for. He had never been much of drinker. He could get away with more because of his size, but certainly didn't test the limits of it like Frithha and Herr Dallas seemed happy to. Simon was being very generous in his rounds, and whether it was just this or these thoughts to spur him on, Anoman drank a little more than he would have usually, and the taverns all seemed to blend into one after they left the Goose. It was well on into the evening now, the gloaming sky already speckled with young stars as he followed his friends through the darkening streets to the next tavern. Anoman knew they were on the bridge, of course, but his mind seemed to be a few steps behind him on things, and it wasn't until he was inside that he recognized just where he was, Samuel glancing up at the sound of the door. Anoman stood frozen on the threshold as he stared out over the lively bustle of the 5 flagons.
"Well, come in, good sirs, let me find you a table. Don't just stand there letting all the heat out, sir." The halfling laughed genially, moving forward to usher Anoman out of the doorway and leading the 3 to a table by the hearth. "Come warm yourself by the fire. Now, what'll it be?"
Simon had given the landlord their order and Samuel had left before Anoman finally gathered himself enough to speak, turning a furious glare on his friend.
"Simon," he breathed,
his outrage at this underhanded act making it hard for him to even form the words.
"Simon, I cannot believe we are not staying here. What is wrong?"
the squire cried, feigning ignorance and quickly changing to a more reasoning tack when that didn't work.
"Ah, come on, Anoman, we've ordered now. Let's just have one in here, at least."
Anoman paused a moment, trying to rein in his temper as Cern had taught him. They could not understand. A fragile balance seemed to exist between he and Frithha at the moment, how she looked at him sometimes, almost as though she was on the edge of realizing how he felt, and he was filled with the fear that the slightest error on his part could ruin things forever. And then there was Simon, who clearly thought he was acting for the best, his friend so eager to help him in this matter that Anoman would much rather everyone just forgot about, especially when he himself was so unsure of how or even if he would proceed. He looked to Eric, who shrugged mildly as though he could see nothing so unreasonable in this request, and Anoman sighed deeply, feeling drunk and foolish, as though even his own thoughts were no longer under his control.
"Fine, just one. But then we..."
But what they would have been was lost as a familiar laugh rang clear over the general clamor of their surroundings. Anoman glanced up to see Frithha slowly ascending the stairs in the corner, though she did not notice them, the girl caught in conversation with the 2 women either side of her who he assumed were actresses from the theater below. Simon beamed as more laughter broke out from the 3.
"Ah, and there is the Lady Frithha with that smile she wears so well. Tell me, is she ever without it?" "Yes, too often lately,"
Anoman muttered darkly, though only Eric seemed to hear him, Simon already on his feet and, to Anoman's horror, calling across to them.
"Ho, my Lady Frithha! Simon, sit down."
But it was too late, and Anoman watched her start at the address, Frithha easily finding Simon in the crowd. Her smile broadened, the 2 women next to her whispering to each other slyly as she returned his wave and began to move over to them.
"Simon!"
Frithha cried, no less than glowing as she greeted the squire.
"Oh, and Sir Eric and Anoman too, what are you 3 doing here?"
Simon shrugged carelessly, giving Anomen the briefest of glances.
Oh, you know, just out for a quiet drink.
Fritha laughed, sending the three an incredulous look.
And you came here, oh, where are my manners?
She continued, stepping back to present her companions, and Eric and Anomen immediately stood as well.
Please allow me to introduce Jenna, who well deserves her title of leading lady and win the best costumier this side of Waterdeep. Friends, this is Sir Eric, Sir Anomen, and Squire Simon, the Order's finest.
The two groups came together at this, with much smiling and polite refuting, and Fritha laughed, drawing out the chair next to Anomen.
Fine, fine, make a liar of me then. So, enjoying your evening, Anomen?
Anomen swallowed dryly, feeling very on show as he answered.
It has been pleasant enough so far. What Anomen means to say,
interrupted Simon smoothly,
is that it is an evening much improved now you charming ladies have joined our company.
He smiled to the girls next to her, and Fritha glanced to Anomen to send him a grin as she rolled her eyes, and the knight felt a pleasant warmth creeping up from his stomach that had nothing to do with the ale.
So is there a reason for this unexpected pleasure?
Continued Simon, nodding his thanks as a server arrived with their drinks.
Oh, Althea just had a tantrum because Surin was apparently blocking her light during the rehearsal,
dismissed Jenna with a sigh, clearly displeased with the interruption, when nodding sympathetically.
Higold called a break while he and the lady patron went off to appease her.
Fritha smiled wryly.
It soon became apparent though that I hadn't the required delicacy for such a task, so I left him down there still trying to soothe her sensibilities.
Eric smiled.
Oh dear, is she usually like this? Yes.
The three chorused ardently, the girls all looking to each other in their surprise and laughing lightly.
You could say she suffers from a more artistic temperament than most,
said Fritha diplomatically.
Yes, and she seems resolved to make all us suffer for it too,
sighed Jenna, and the group laughed.
Now, what is this?
Came a stern and rather nasal voice above them, and the two girls started, Anomen looking up to see the figure of Higold looming over them.
Really, ladies, the break ended a quarter hour ago. It was my fault, Higold, I pressed them to stay,
Fritha lied unashamedly, dipping her face in false regret. The director gave the three women a rather fatherly look.
Well, I shall say no more then. Now come along, Jenna, we are ready to rehearse the parlor scene. And you too, Win.
The two women rose, the men standing too as they made their goodbyes before Higold ushered them downstairs. Fritha watched them go, smiling fondly as Higold muttered admonishments to the pair as they went.
So, my lady Fritha,
continued Eric rather formally as they took their seats once more,
how went your search of the crypts today?
Fritha glanced to the man next to her, faintly surprised Anomen had not already regaled them with this tale.
Anomen has not told you? I will admit I would be intrigued to hear about it myself. Jaehaera and I could not accompany them, you see, we had a conflicting engagement to attend elsewhere in the city. We have found nothing in the crypts as yet, my lady,
Anomen answered quickly, seemingly concerned he had yet to ask her the same.
But how went your meeting with the cowled wizards? I spoke briefly to Jaehaera before I left the coronet, she said it was not entirely as you had hoped. No,
Fritha replied promptly, her voice bright and airy as she continued,
but there is still hope. All we need do is find this murderer for them, and there is still a chance Imoen could be returned. Imoen!
Came Simon, and the pair turned as one, both seemingly having forgotten they were not alone. Fritha smiled apologetically.
Oh, I'm sorry, how rude of us. Imoen is my friend, she was arrested and imprisoned by the Cowled Wizards, about 2 months ago now, in a misunderstanding concerning a minor breach of the city's anti-magic laws. I have been working towards her release ever since. Ah, yes, Anomen did mention something,
offered Simon quietly before trailing off altogether, and a palpable feeling of gloom seemed to descend over the table.
So,
continued Eric stalwartly,
Anomen told us you ran the playhouse here, Fritha.
Fritha smiled slightly.
Well, I fear run is a bit of an exaggeration, as you can see Higold does most of the work. You selected the cast, my lady. And you wrote the score.
Anomen cut in sharply.
Every day you are here to help with some problem or another. I do not believe there would even be a play without you.
Fritha swallowed as she flushed pink, Anomen suddenly rigid in his chair, looking as uncomfortable as she felt.
I help where I can,
she managed after a moment, rather wishing that said theatre would throw some other crisis her way so she could graciously quit the table. It was not that she did not like the men's company, but Anomen was acting strangely, as though he was worried she would somehow embarrass him, and it was making her feel ill at ease. So, Fritha continued in the manner of one casting awkwardly about for conversation,
where have you been already tonight? We started at the Myth Rest and then headed to the Goose and Grain,
offered Simon promptly.
Oh yes? I've not been in the Myth Rest before, but I remember the Goose for the music. You like to dance, my lady?
inquired Eric.
Yes, when I can. Why, that is good news!
exclaimed Simon with real enthusiasm.
Many of our friends are of the same mind and we are always in need of partners. We shall have to arrange a gathering. Anomen here claims he does not like to dance, but I am sure for you, Fritha, he would make an exception.
But Fritha merely laughed, sending the knight next to her a fond smile.
Well, he certainly didn't the last time I asked him.
It was something she was to instantly regret. Anomen looked as though he wished the ground would open up and swallow him whole, Simon and Eric clearly trying not to laugh.
Oh, I was only teasing,
she continued hurriedly, trying to rectify her mistake.
I didn't mind or anything, We could return to the Goose now if you wished to dance, my lady,
Anomen interrupted quietly, ignoring the pair opposite.
The evening is yet young.
Fritha smiled, feeling both grateful and relieved.
It's kind of you to offer, Anomen, against your inclination though I know it to be, but it is fine. Besides, dancing is best on a light heart, not a light head.
She raised her cup in toast to him and they laughed, the previous awkwardness finally gone from the air. And there the group stayed and spent the rest of their evening, and after a while Anomen too seemed to relax, whatever had been troubling him clearly passing, the man laughing along with the rest of them as Simon and sometimes Eric related stories of when they were all but young squires of the order, callow and foolish. It was late now, the moon already on its descent as they left the tavern, Fritha walking abreast with Eric and continuing their talk from before, while Simon and Anomen, the pair somewhat deeper in their cups than they, held an earnest albeit whispered exchange as they followed them through the dark streets. Fritha smiled at the man next to her. Eric was easily the most handsome of the three friends, his face pale and sculpted, the black waves of hair that swept carelessly down to curl about his collar giving him a noble look. His manner was different too, grave and quiet, though without the austerity that seemed to accompany such characteristics in others.
So tell me, was it true that Simon managed to trick you into believing he had already been knighted when you first arrived here in Athkatla?
Eric smiled slightly, dipping his head in confirmation.
I fear so, my lady. I was fresh from rather strict a seminary when I joined the order at 16. Simon was quite tall for his age at the time and when I first met him, it was in the courtyard when he was taking his knight's horse out for its exercise. When on horseback he looked even more imposing, and I could not help but salute as I passed, and so the joke was born from there. He had me convinced he was the youngest knight in the history of the order, and he had even persuaded some other boys to pretend they were squired to him to further the trick.
Frithla was giggling merrily by this point, Eric smiling as he continued the tale of his shame.
I only discovered the deception a few days later when I saw him running an errand for his own knight. I was angry at first, but Simon apologized and offered to help me with my own chores for that 10-day in recompense, and I realized it was all in good humor.
He shook his head, glancing back to where Simon was still talking with a gnomon, the blond man laughing quietly as a gnomon glared at him.
I swear, he has not changed a bit since, and I would not have it otherwise.
Frithla smiled, about to reply when a smooth female voice cut her off.
Good evening, friends.
Eric had drawn his sword in an instant, the young paladin staring into the shadows of the alley next to them, and behind her, Frithla heard the hiss of metal on metal as a gnomon and Simon follow suit. Frithla lay a hand on her sword hilt, though she made no move to draw it, following Eric's gaze into the alley to where the outline of a woman was stood, the shapes of her companions shifting silently at her back, and Frithla felt cold as a wave of inexplicable dread washed over her. Eric was scowling, his fine face suddenly hard.
I am no friend of yours, creature. What do you want? Speak.
Frithla could hear from the woman's voice that she found his demands amusing.
Stand down your weapons, knights. I bear only words, and they are not for you. From my mistress's description, you do not usually keep such pious company, my lady Frithla.
She stepped forward from the shadows, the light from the street lamps falling first on the hem of her skirts and creeping up the rich green gown to finally reveal a pale angular face framed on either side by heavy black ringlets, and Frithla felt herself draw a sharp breath as she recognized the tall, gracile form of Parisa. Parisa herself was no longer smiling either, the vampire staring back at her, seemingly just as surprised.
You!
The woman exclaimed, and suddenly she was laughing, something, Frithla considered, that would have made the woman look quite pretty had it not been for the eloquent point to her teeth.
I was led to believe the last time we met, that you were just a trembling little girl from the crown.
Frithla shrugged, still a little taken aback by how the meeting was proceeding.
Well, yes, I thought it was for the best at the time, with you likely to kill me and all.
Parisa smiled generously.
It was cleverly done, and I do not bear a grudge. I can see now you are all my mistress expects and more. My mistress has bade me deliver a message to you. She wishes you to meet with her to discuss your captured companion. She knows already of your efforts to locate her and wishes to lend her assistance.
Frithla felt her heart grow cold. If there was one thing in the world Parisa could have offered her that would make her even consider such a meeting, it would have been that. She stared back at the vampire coolly.
Oh yes, and what will that cost me?
Parisa inclined her head in slight apology.
I can only say what I have been asked to. My mistress would meet with you tomorrow in the hour after sunset on the edge of the cemetery in the southwest of the city. May I tell her you will attend her there?
Frithla nodded once.
You may.
Parisa smiled broadly, it held a predatory look.
Excellent. My mistress will be most pleased. A good evening to you, my lady.
One step back into the shadows and she was gone.
We just let them walk away,
cried Simon, looking outraged. Eric sent him a quelling glare.
Be silent, Simon, you're in no state to pick a fight with anyone. Are you well, my lady? He continued, his voice milder as he turned to her. That creature seemed to know you, She said you have met before.
Frithia sighed and nodded.
Yes, I stumbled upon them once just up from the docks. They are the rival guild that has the thieves here in such an uproar. We should get back to the inn. Are you all right to return to the order with Simon?
Eric frowned.
Well, yes, but what of you and Anomen? I do not like the idea. We'll be fine, won't we?
She cut in, turning her attention to the man behind her, Anomen confirming this with a curt nod.
Besides, they're hardly likely to ask me to meet with their mistress and then attempt to kill me before I do.
Eric looked little reassured by this, but he relented all the same and the group made their farewells, the men turning to head back to the order while Anomen and Frithia continued on to the slums. Anomen felt suddenly very sober, the night's merriment but a memory now, and the pair walked on in silence before he asked the inevitable question.
So, you are going to meet with them?
Frithia smiled grimly.
Oh, yes. Alone? Goodness, I hope not!
She exclaimed with a bark of hollow laughter. Anomen swallowed dryly, not sure he wanted to even know the answer as he continued.
And if they offer you a path to Mon?
Frithia stopped, turning to him, her face tired and almost sad in the moonlight.
Let's just say, we'll wait and see, Anomen.
She turned back to continue their path and he paused a moment before following her. The world that had seemed so warm and full of promise mere moments ago was now all cold uncertainty. He had made vows, firstly as a priest and more recently as a knight, vows to stand against such creatures. To have at last achieved all he had desired, only to instantly have such loyalties tested. How cruel a fate would make him choose between his honor and his heart. End of chapter.